So welcome to our lecture on creativity, and a little bit of musical formula. We'll talk about musical formula more in our next lecture as well. But I want to ask the question or ask how creativity is culturally determined, if it's a universal trait that is maybe not dependent on culture, or is it a little bit of both. Right off the bat, I think it's a little bit of both. I think creativity, the way we discuss it, and as we'll see throughout the lecture, is definitely culturally determined. But I think there is something about human physiology, the human brain, outside of culture that may be also influencing the way creativity works, how it operates, how we are creative beings. Before we go on, I want to just comment also, though, on there were many really thoughtful discussion answers to the questions of talent and also of identity that on the discussion board. So I really want to thank you guys for commenting and for your answers. It's a little hard to have a discussion, such spaced out in time, but I really appreciate your answers, and I recognize those who are commenting and making such nice contributions to the class discussion. So I have several definitions here of what creativity is. And giving you just a few ideas, there's some important points that they need to be made. But creativity generally is the ability to transcend ideas, traditional ideas, rules, and patterns. So it's creating new ideas, new patterns, and forming new interpretations that are not necessarily thought of before. It's an inventiveness. It's a kind of invention of something new. And it's also the ability to recognize alternatives or possibilities when kind of solving problems or creating something new. These definitions, as you see on your screen, are all in a sense very Western centric in terms of creativity, and we'll talk about the differences between maybe Western European American ideals of creativity and some other ideals from around the world. But the idea that creating something new out of or recognizing unusual patterns is important in one part of definition of creativity. There are two types of kind of creative thinking. And it is, as discussed in your article, there's kind of a divergent creative thinking and a convergent thinking, and both of these can be creative. So divergent thinking would be the definitions from the previous slides, really answers from unexpected combinations, remote associations, or transforming information, be that music, be that visual arts, in an unexpected way. And convergent thinking is really finding the logical association being accurate and also coming up with the decision-making strategies that produce quality or good answers. And it sounds like the convergent thinking maybe on first blush is not creative, but it's kind of systematic, and kind of the idea of systematic is almost in our society is kind of the opposite of creativity, really. But in both of these types of thinking, as I think you got from your article, require some degree of creative thinking, creative inventiveness to get to the best and or most unexpected answer. There is another sense of creativity from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's book Creativity, Flow, and the Psychology of Discovery and Invention. And his quote is that creativity is any act, idea, or product that changes an existing domain or that transforms an existing domain into a new one. What counts is whether the novelty he or she produces is accepted for the inclusion in the domain. And this really points to the most important part about how we talk about creativity in the US and Europe and the US really, is that anything can be novel, anything can be kind of unusual or kind of crazy or outlying, but to be really counted as creativity, to be counted as creative, we in the West especially have to find it useful. And so I think it's important to remember that we're judging an idea not on its kind of novelty necessarily, but on a combination of novelty and usefulness. So in a sense, creativity without usefulness is worthless, right? And this posits a very interesting question about music, especially since for a long time we've considered music as not in the realm of being useful, although I would debate that. There are many very useful uses for music. But in many, throughout time, music has seen something as kind of a leisure activity, something that's not essential for survival, like food and or shelter. And so if creativity involves some discussion or some valuation of usefulness, what does this mean for music? And I think you should think about that a little bit. So how can creativity be and music be useful? And this kind of complexity or this difficulty in maybe squaring certain notions of creativity with the notion of musical creativity, that leads not to another question: is creativity in the musical realm, does this defy the accepted definition of creativity found elsewhere, or is music some kind of special case? And these are all quite complex questions that we can't really answer in one lecture, but there are things you can think about. So I think it's important for us to go home and after this lecture and think about creativity in terms of invention and of changing domains, and also in terms of realms of usefulness. And again, trying to figure out whether or not music is useful in and of itself, or it's useful for certain tasks, for certain activities. And we'll obviously, leading off of your article you read, we'll talk about music as being useful for certain things. I want to encourage you to also look at the previous authors' work on creativity, and mostly on the kind of state of flow. So Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow has been really important, and I think it's a really interesting way of understanding the kind of creative process. I mean, I think we all understand this. Once you're in the groove, once you're in this way of thinking, ideas just happen. They just kind of their output is easy, rather than sitting down and having some kind of block. This idea of flow, once we get into that state, that mental state of flow, creativity is kind of almost just a byproduct of that. And so again, go look up Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. It's a very interesting and powerful way of approaching creativity and work as an artist and as students as well. So before we go on farther and have some examples and some interesting ways music and creativity have propped up, I wanted to talk about how I've mentioned how creativity is formulated according to culture. Really, we have a sense of what being creative is in the West versus there is, I think, different ways that culture can impact the idea of creativity throughout the world. And I don't want to maybe reify the West and the East so much, but we'll talk about kind of differences maybe across the world. But there's kind of 4 ways that have been mentioned about how creativity can be influenced by culture. And the first way is that there are different conceptions of what creative is, or what is creative, and so that depending on where you are in what culture you're living in, there are different ways that we categorize creative invention. There are also possibly different psychological processes that are engaged in creative thinking and creative work that may be different depending on the culture you're in. And by psychological process, I'm saying there are different ways that the brain is making connections, or different ways of different methods of thinking, basically, that are used in different cultures. And we'll again see examples of this in later slides. There's the idea that language influences the development and type of creativity. And so if we think about language being the way we communicate, or one way we communicate, of course, the way language is structured, the way things are way kind of analogies and associations are made, that will, of course, influence the way creativity is developed and or used, basically. So language is vitally important in how we describe creativity, and also how it is actually worked out in our brain. And lastly, the idea that the environment plays a really large role in promoting or inhibiting types of creativity. And so in this sense, you can think of, and we'll discuss this again, we'll discuss this more, you can think of how in the West, maybe there's been kind of this emphasis on the creative individual, the genius, and kind of the individuality of the artistic genius is really conducive to certain types of creative output. And if you think about different cultures, and they're kind of not maybe not such an emphasis on the individual and more an emphasis on the kind of collective nature of human society, but there are different, that kind of creates a different valuation for, and then a different type of creativity emerges out of that type of society or culture. So rather than emphasizing individual artistic genius, maybe there's more of an emphasis on the collectivist kind of culture and the function of creativity as helping out the group rather than promoting the ideas of an individual. So moving on from these ideas, we can look at different ways creativity is discussed and or manifests itself in different cultures. And so again, at the risk of making kind of a binary opposition between the West and the East, there may be some differences in the way cultures approach creativity and how they classify something as creative or not. And so the first maybe thing I want you to remember is that in the West, like I mentioned, the Western norms prioritize originality and novelty over usefulness or appropriateness. And we can think of examples of this, especially in terms of maybe kind of radical creative artists and how the originality and novelty is the draw for these artists rather than the usefulness. And so to my mind, just right off the bat comes off to like Andy Warhol's work. He has very original work. It's very a different take and spin on visual work that was obviously considered very creative. I don't know how useful some of his paintings and or art may have been, but it certainly was valued in the West or in America and Europe. So in other cultures across the world, sometimes in China or Japan especially, there is a slightly more of an emphasis on the appropriateness of creative development. If it's fitting with cultural norms, if it's fitting with, or if it's useful for the kind of a more of a collectivist vision of society. And so that's maybe just two different ways you can think about how culture may help develop or inhibit creative products or thought. There's another way of thinking about creativity, and that maybe is in terms of time. And so we can think of, there's a very strong tradition in the West where we think of time as this linear progression. We're going from the past, we're working towards the future. And so as a result of this way of conceptualizing time, we have certain types of creativity or creative output that are valued. And so we're in the West, there's oftentimes this emphasis on a new invention, or the invention of something new, or the new associations that haven't ever been thought of in the past. And there are many other cultures throughout the world that work on or conceptualize time as more of a cyclical process. And so the reuse or the reinvention of tradition might be slightly more valuable in these types of cultures. And again, like I mentioned before, the kind of the cultural focus between the individual or the collective may also influence the types and the process of creativity. So again, in the West, we've had a very strong tradition of individual, the kind of elevation of the individual, versus in many different cultures, there were also this emphasis on the good of the collective over the individual, and that will irrefutably really influence the way and what is accepted, what is thought of as useful. So remember, we have to think about creativity not just as something novel, but something that has some sort of use or some sort of valuation. And so if a culture or society values the group in a slightly different way than the individual, then that's going to affect the marking of something as creative. That's going to affect the designation of a creative and useful and or novel type of art, product, etc. And as you mentioned, as you read in your article, creativity is not just something that happens in isolation, but really mood has a measurable effect on creativity. And so the article you read discussed how happy or upbeat music increases creativity. But I think what's important to note, though, especially in the article, it's not necessarily the happiness or quote unquote of the music, but really what I drew from it is more of the brain being activated rather than the brain being kind of in a neutral state. But if there's some kind of activation, meaning increased blood flow, increased synapse activity, that kind of activated state is helpful in terms of producing unexpected combinations or novel ideas. And so my question is, although it wasn't quite addressed in the article, is that might intense sadness or kind of pathos, that type of activation of the brain, help in creativity and creative thought? And maybe that's something you can go experiment with. You can go listen to music that you have associate with being happy and upbeat, and try to maybe do some creative tests or creative activities, and we'll do some in this lecture as well. And also listen to something where you find it intensely emotionally, maybe even sad, and also try and find out if this helps in terms of creative output. This is really kind of an individual judgment on your own part, but I think there's something to be said that just because the music is sad doesn't mean it's deactivating your brain. So I think there's a lot of room for research and exploration in the realm of creativity. It's a very like the ideas of talent we've talked about before. Creativity is this very nebulous and very difficult concept to come up with hard facts about, and so there's a lot of room for interpretation and a lot of room for experimentation. So I'd encourage you to go out and do some of that on your own. There's also a sense that creativity is always somehow linked with not only usefulness, there's also a sense that creativity can come out of something, kind of a formula, can come out of tradition. And so I've given several musical examples of this for you to listen to. And I want you to maybe go listen to all three of these examples. There's Pachelbel's Canon, there's Autumn Leaves, jazz kind of standard, and there's Roberta Flack, Killing Me Softly. And think about all these examples. Think if you find them creative, and listen to all three of these, and then come back to the lecture, and we'll discuss kind of the idea of creativity and formula. So I'm sure you noticed after listening to all those three, there are similarities despite the kind of vast differences between them. And one of the main similarities you're going to see here is this descending fifths harmonic progression. And this is used by countless other composers in different realms. And so you have that Pachelbel canon descending fifths, so 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, 1, 4, 5. You find that in all three of the examples I gave you. You find that in many other examples like Blues Traveler's Hook or Aerosmith's Cryin', another song, Graduation by Vitamin C, just a million different songs. But this idea that even though you're using a formula, there can be creative uses of that formula. There can be creative interpretations or new connections. And I think these three different examples are great at demonstrating the use of how creativity is not just invention out of nowhere, but it's kind of the reuse and or a new interpretation or new connections you can make with even the same harmonic material. And I think if you take that idea, kind of the reinvention of tradition, you'll find many other examples in European American music. That also is vitally important to other cultures, as I mentioned before. The kind of newness of something is not necessarily what's valued, but the kind of reinterpretation, the reuse of older traditions and or products in a new way is also valued more. So I thought this, since creativity is well, not because creativity is so difficult to talk about, but it is a fairly complex topic that is still being very much researched. I think we should do some research in this class, and I thought it'd be fun to take a test. And this is the alternative use test, which is basically giving alternative uses for a specific word. And so what I've done is created a little survey on SurveyMonkey. You can, if the link is posted on Canvas, you can look at the link on your screen, or maybe if you can, scan that QR code. Go to this survey and follow the directions really. So you have the survey open on SurveyMonkey, and then have the Canvas web page open for today's lecture. And I've given you 4 different music examples, and then 4 sets of questions, 4 sets of alternative uses to do. And so what I would encourage you to do is listen to each music sample either before or while you're trying to answer the appropriate example alternative use question, and just see how if it just come up with your best answers. And what I'm going to try and do is assemble all the answers from the class from the survey into a document, and then I'll have that posted, and we'll discuss it later and see if there's any differences or interesting things that are found. And yeah, so I would say go to the survey on SurveyMonkey, complete the questions, but while listening to the 4 examples that are posted on Canvas. And then come back and I'll discuss a little bit of the different musics that I posted for you. So then instead of using European classical music like your article you read, I've given you 4 different examples from around the world, and we'll discuss maybe some of the how these are related to kind of the ideas of happy, sad, and calm or anxious music, and maybe how they may or may not have influenced your creative word association. So go do that and come back to the lecture, and we'll continue on. So I hope you enjoyed the alternative use test. Unfortunately, I only gave you 10 slots to answer each one of those word kind of association alternative uses for those words. But hopefully you came up with some interesting and creative ways of different uses for those objects I mentioned. So you had 4 different examples, probably music, some of it you've heard, obviously maybe you probably heard the piano piece, but maybe you haven't heard these other ones. But I'd be interested to hear your feedback on if it, or actually see the results of the survey and see if it actually did influence the kind of creative output. And so I'll discuss a few of these examples and maybe why I chose them for their the use in the kind of creative test. The first example you heard was the Chinese Guqin, and you heard a piece called "Flowing Water." I think you would hear that in the kind of melodic movement of the piece. And the Guqin, or the qin, is a really ancient Chinese instrument. It's the favorite of philosophers and thinkers in ancient China. It was associated with Confucius, and it's really been around for at least 3,000 years. We've found qin in tombs that are 2,500 years old, so it's a very ancient instrument, ancient way of playing, and again a favorite of philosophers in that it's a solo instrument, be played really only for oneself. It's not meant so much for performance in a kind of a public or concert setting. It's really meant as a kind of a philosophical and meditative type music. Incidentally, the piece you heard, the flowing water, was put on the golden records that were shot into space in the Voyager spacecraft as a kind of an example of humanity's creative output. And I chose that piece because it was maybe contemplative in a sense, but also not quite calm. It had the kind of flowing, that's this flow sense. Maybe that was influencing of your alternative uses words test. We'll see. A lot of the kind of aesthetic you heard, kind of the scratchiness, you're supposed to actually hear the player's hands slide across the strings. You're supposed to hear the harmonics, etc. All these other interesting aesthetic qualities of the qin that maybe are a little bit different than other instruments across the world. The second example I chose was Makam Bayati, performed on an oud and a bozuk. Actually, this is one of the performers was my former teacher of mine at UCLA. And Bayati is like a very, very common Arab and Turkish mode of music, makam. And it's mostly a natural minor scale, except for there's a kind of a half flat second degree, which you heard a little bit. You'll hear this piece of music all across the Middle East. It's favored in pop music, etc. It's also used in religious music as well. And I chose it because it was not, it was kind of nebulous in terms of its emotional affect, although there are kind of emotional affects associated with this particular maqam. But I think it was interesting the trade-off between the two instruments, the different improvisations going on in the maqam. The third example, I'm sorry, that was the third example. The second example was the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven, a piano. And again, I chose this as maybe the one piece, the familiar piece that you all heard before. And I chose it also because there's a real kind of agitation in the music, and I wanted to know if that agitated sound, in contrast to maybe the flowing sound of the Chinese Jin, or the kind of maybe contrast that also with the Maqam Bayati in terms of the kind of nebulousness of its emotional affect. But I was thinking maybe the Moonlight Sonata might give you some sort of sense of agitation, and maybe that was increasing your brain activity or not, and we'll maybe see the results from the alternative use tests. The fourth example I chose because to me it's a very happy sounding rag. This is a North Indian classical piece performed on the sitar, sarod, and tabla. And you can see pictures of all these instruments. You have the bottom of your screen is the chin, the upper left-hand side is the oud, the kind of smallest picture in there is a buzuk, which is a long neck, kind of more twangy sounding Arab instrument, and the top right-hand corner is your sarod, which is a fretless, multi-stringed North Indian instrument. I didn't put the sitar and tabla out there. I thought you might already know that. But the Rag Khalaj to me is a very happy sounding, or uplifting, active. It's played normally at midnight, but it's a very romantic and light type of rag. It's a combination of actually two ragas. And again, I chose this for its kind of happy and uplifting qualities. And so we'll see if that was maybe influencing the associations that you guys had. So I think this was a very kind of short lecture. There's several ideas that came out of here about how music, brain activity, etc., might be influenced by music. I think it's interesting to know that there really have been very, very few cross-cultural or other cultural studies of creativity. The few that have come out of the discussions of creativity have been centered around the kind of the West and Western music and etc. So I think it would be nice for you guys to go out and find some different types of music and see if it influences you. But what I think would be really interesting for you to do, and this is not going to be graded, but I think for everyone's sake, for your sake, especially as musicians, as students, as just people in the world in a world that is highly values creativity and creative thought, is to keep a creativity journal. And this is nothing major. Write down, take a minute or two, and write when you feel most creative. Note the setting, note the mood, note if you're listening to music or not, if you're well fed or not, if it's what time of day, etc. Kind of note every little feature you can in 30 seconds or a minute when you're feeling the most productive and creative. And remember that the creativity generally has some sort of relationship to usefulness. And so if you're being productive, you probably are also being creative, and vice versa. So again, write this down in your creative journal. See if it maybe helps you in terms of getting your work done or coming up with great ideas or great music, etc. And if you're noticing a pattern in your creative journal, maybe you're noticing that you're always creative from 10 to noon in the morning, or if you're creative after you've had certain foods or drinks or whatever it is, if you're noticing a pattern in that creativity and you're noticing it's useful and it's productive and it's creative, then try to replicate those instances on different days or at different times, etc., and see if you can keep that creative output going. As a society our society obviously super values creative thought, creative thinking, and so to make yourself more practiced in it, just like talent, and the other article we read for today was about how talent doesn't exist really. It's all about practice. I believe there's a similar sense with creativity. You can't just be creative out of nowhere. I think being creative is also a practiced condition, and so maybe a creative journal might help you achieve greater creativity. So the last few things to keep in mind as a kind of a recap is that creativity and the way we discuss it is absolutely influenced by our culture, that in the West we're very influenced by the idea of an individual artistic creative genius, and in other cultures that is not so much the focus, and so there are different types of creativity are valued. The second thing to remember is that creativity has to be useful to last, for it to be recognized as a creative object or artistic output, etc. So the usefulness, is that judgment of it, is really important and central to the idea of creativity. And finally, that since creativity is this very difficult concept to pin down, just like talent, it's very difficult to pin down. I think your self-evaluation, our evaluation on the alternative use test is important, but your self-evaluation with these creative journals is really important too, and I think that'll really help not only you but everyone around you in terms of getting things done, being productive, coming up with creative solutions for things. The fact that there are two types of thinking, maybe that divergent and convergent thinking, and that both require creativity, although different types of creativity, is also important to remember too. It's important to remember that creativity is not just necessarily the ultimate novelness of something, but it's also the usefulness and the kind of accuracy and etc. All these things play together in terms of creative output. So thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing the results of the alternative use test, and I'll post that again as soon as I get as many responses as I think is appropriate. And look forward to talking with you during our next lecture. Thanks.